Culminating this search for the idea of a city of towers that is architect designed and controlled and efficient is a built example in 3 blocks of a kind of visionary projection that we saw in Ferris's work and in Hood's City of Towers proposals. This 3-block built example is Rockefeller Center. So the city of the future is realized, at least, in this subsection of New York. The subtitle, and one which came to me sort of, I don't know, mysteriously or something subconsciously, I guess, is the future in amber. So what does that mean? It sort of suggests, and one of the great architects of this period, Ralph Walker, whose work we didn't look at because he's a commercial architect practicing building skyscrapers and many kinds of projects, but he wasn't a visionary, he wasn't an urbanist. But he wrote a book called A Fly in Amber, and the idea of amber being the nectar which is solidified and then under pressure turned to a kind of stone, and captures whatever it surrounds. A fly in amber, or the future in amber, is something that's frozen in time that becomes timeless. So a future that's timeless was the idea that sort of came to me about Rockefeller Center, because there are these 2 characters of Rockefeller Center. One is that it is the rationalized city of the future. The other is that it holds back, that it's conservative by virtue of its clients, in its architecture remains backward-looking rather than forward-looking if we think of the direction that modernism played out, which is the international style. And we're going to explore that across the images this evening. So the next, please. So Rockefeller Center, to see it in a series of images that sort of define it in its period, and of course its period begins in 1928, really, when the first designs that are the preliminary architectural schemes that promote the Metropolitan Square project, a new home for the Metropolitan Opera House that we'll look at in a moment. So from 1928 through a decade, really, 1939, we're going to look at images of the last rivet. It doesn't mark the end of the development of Rockefeller Center, but it concludes a decade of planning, construction, of design, planning, design, construction, and then at least some sort of completion of the central idea. The next place, you can see that central tower of the RCA Building, as it came to be called. Now we call it by its address, 30 Rockefeller Center. As we rise up, we can see the importance of the symmetricality of the symmetry of the site, the classicism of this lithic architecture, its axiality on the central tower, which is, of course, Raymond Hood's key concept of turning skyscrapers into towers, and the way that it orders in the harmonious ensemble this 3-block site, still under construction, as you can see on the north end. The next one, please. And the RCA Building has these 2 characters. One is to see it as this shooting tower, straight up, slender, a shaft going straight up into the sky. The other is seeing it in its long cross-town expanse as it stretches from Fifth Avenue and its plaza coming off Fifth Avenue, but the axis comes directly from your experience of the avenue. Back all the way to 6th Avenue, Avenue of the Americas, where at the time the elevated train cut off most of the views and helped to limit the real estate value of the back side of the block, which is one of the things we're going to be exploring, sort of real estate invention and the real estate problem that was solved by the clients and the architects. So these 2 characters of the RCA Building, as well as Rockefeller Center overall. Next, please. Future and tradition. The density on the site slowly gets built up around the centerpiece of the RCA Building, adding several 100,000 square feet in a suite of buildings that surround the centerpiece and fill out the complex, but all in the same harmonious palette of limestone and aluminum spandrels and vertical expression of the lined windows, so that the sort of soaring verticality is as much a unity for the ensemble as is the planarity and the sort of honed surface of the limestone facade. The next, please. And that density of skyscrapers that grow up as a commercial venture is born out of this idea of the metropolitan square that we're going to look at in some more detail. But in this first rendering from 1928, May 1928, so a good 80 years ago now, the architect Benjamin Wister Morris produced for a group of gentlemen led by Otto Kahn, the multi-millionaire and great opera lover, who undertook to try to create a new home for the Metropolitan Opera that had been, that was at the time down below Herald Square on Broadway, or on 7th Avenue, I guess, where an outmoded theater with poor sight lines and boxes that held New York's 400, the opera lovers that were the social set of New York, had long attended the Metropolitan Opera, and had long desired to have a brand new home. Led by Otto Kahn, who had assembled a series of lots over on West 57th Street with the plan of placing the opera there, eventually gave up on that plan, but set his eye on John D. Rockefeller Jr., who would become the patron of this larger project. Can I have the next, please? So that these commercial towers surrounding an open square with an opera at the centerpiece, a civic institution as the centerpiece, became translated into the Rockefeller Center that we know, here switching its orientation around with Fifth Avenue down on this side, to be a commercial complex with the world's largest skyscraper in terms of the volume of space, so it even edged out the Empire State Building and the amount of office space that it provided, and a suite of buildings that surrounded it that drew you back from Fifth Avenue all the way 800 feet to 6th Avenue and placed on 11 acres of Manhattan real estate, underutilized Manhattan real estate, placed 15 buildings on 11 acres site. But this took a good many years, at least 3 or 4 years, 3 years in the planning, 10 years in the construction, but most particularly a stock market crash and a depression. Stock market crash in 1929, in the months before the plan for the Metropolitan Opera was approved, and then reinvented towards a commercial project. The stock market crash of 1929, the long slide in the early 1930s into the Depression, until by 1932, 1933, when the first buildings opened, New York and the rest of the U.S. was at the very bottom of the economic cycle of depression, with unemployment, a huge proportion of nearly a quarter of people of the population unemployed, and a financial crisis that impacted everybody involved in the project, including, and essential to this project, the world's richest man, the Rockefeller family, John D. Rockefeller. And this project was his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s special project, in which he valiantly came in like a chivalrous knight, agreeing to underwrite the opera project, and then continued the commercial project as he was trapped in the situation of already having bought out the leases, or undertaken a lease agreement with Columbia University. We're going to see the site plan in a few minutes. and then buying out the subleases of all the tenants on the individual buildings on the site. The next, please. The story of Rockefeller Center is so rich and so detailed that it's very difficult to try to summarize it and to place it in a chronology in which it unfolds in anything that begins to compare the richness of the topic and the complexity that focuses on the site. And I've praised this book before a number of times in the whole series, Great Fortune and Daniel Okrent's masterful historical research, and then his vivid retelling of the cast of characters that surround this project. The next, please. The many aspects of it, and inside of the frontispiece of Great Fortune, he has kindly laid out for us not only the site plan of the various buildings, but also their many names in all of their incarnations as they are bought by one or another company or what become the headquarters. So you can see some of the buildings as they did dispose on the site, and we're going to see a whole range of site plans that change each time and adjust to new conditions. But here in 1948, the 15 buildings on the site. The next, please. Okrent in particular gets into the minds of the characters and explains sort of infuses his text, his narrative, with kind of psychological and particularly vivid storyteller's account of the many characters who were part of the team that developed Rockefeller Center. But the key person, the one at the top, we'll see, of the hierarchy of the plan of responsibility is John D. Rockefeller Jr., who you see here in the completely press-promoted opportunity for an event which was called the Driving of the Last Rivet, and then was memorialized in a little book called The Last Rivet. And this is the frontispiece picture where, having been tutored in how to hold the cricket, the riveting gun, the pneumatic riveting gun, is ceremoniously driving a rivet here for a press photo that was flashed around the world and taken up by newspapers everywhere. The next, please. Rockefeller, you see in the center here, was a very dour man. And like his father before him, who was a teetotaler and rarely showed any emotion, he was very circumspect, always quiet, a penny pincher, so that even with the grand fortune that he did have, he watched every single nickel and dime and wrote voluminously in correspondence that Dan Okrent seems to have read every piece of paper of, overseeing the financial blueprints for Rockefeller Center. But he rarely effused about anything. And here you can see him having driven his rivet in the center of a cast of characters with the very gregarious Nelson Rockefeller, who is only in his late 20s here at the time. Well, I guess he'd be in his early 30s because we're in 1929, who's talking to Thomas Murray, who's representing the AFL, the labor unions that were key to the agreements on the site, especially during the Depression, with David Sarnoff of RCA, so the media mogul, with Rockefeller, with Nicholas Murray Butler, who was the president of Columbia, who owned the site and leased it to the Rockefellers for Rockefeller Center, and then Hugh Robertson, who organized sort of the business work on the site. And so they're there in '39, marking a decade's worth of work with about 10 or so buildings completed on the site. The next, please. And each of them is profiled in Dan Okrent's great book. Now, there's another book that includes Rockefeller Center that was that has been very influential, certainly influenced me, and it's Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York, that you can see was published well before Dan Okrent's here in 1978, so 30 years ago today, which is, 30 years ago this year, which is really extraordinary. Of course, Koolhaas has gone on to become one of the most important modern contemporary architects in the world, and builds all over. The CCTV China television headquarters is one of his most recent and tallest of his constructions. But back in 1978, he was a fellow at the Institute for Urban Design in New York, which had its headquarters in Raymond Hood's American Radiator Building. And he was doing research on New York, running a lab, a kind of studio. And theorizing New York, as he called it, because Delirious New York was, in his terminology, a retroactive manifesto for Manhattan. And he looks into and through and brilliantly fantasizes a New York's. He places himself in New York of the 1920s and sort of fantasizes a life which is half true and I think half fiction. It's half Koolhaas reading and sort of celebration and exaggeration of the conditions of the time, which get, the next please, very close, I think, to some of the delirium that was New York in the 1920s. And in a series of great images that were made for each one of the chapter headings by his wife, Madeline Vriesendorf, you see the sexualized skyscrapers of the Empire State and the Chrysler, which are also profiled in long chapters. But then the chapter on Rockefeller Center, how perfect perfection can be, the creation of Rockefeller Center, and he goes into, in a very different way than Dan Okrent does, the characters that everything that's sort of over the top about Rockefeller Center, every exaggeration, every press release, every tired ballerina in the dropping from exhaustion in Radio City Music Hall performances. The whole thing becomes a kind of phantasmagoria of New York, New York at night, New York inebriated, New York as sort of the fun house and the Coney Island of the world. And of course the policeman in all of this, sort of apropos to the character of John D. Rockefeller and his penny pinching wealth, is Rockefeller Center, the most sober sort of any of the buildings of the period. The next, please. Futuricity. So what can I add to Dan Okrent's jam-packed, fact-filled, thoroughly reliable history of Rockefeller Center in 400 or so pages in Great Fortune? And what can I possibly add to Delirious New York, which is one of the most heartfelt or palpitating celebrations of the place of New York, the sort of insanity of Manhattan, the surreal character of the very energized economics of Manhattan. What can I add to those two readings, which are, on the one hand so thorough and on the other so phenomenally, beautifully exaggerated and felt? Well, I had this idea about futuricity, which is a word, a term that I coined for a word which is supposed to mean an optimistic, a progressive and optimistic attitude towards the future city. And this is a word which to me describes the attitudes of the men like Hood, Corbett, and Ferris. The next, please. And so I think what I can do and what I can trace in this lecture is the roots of the idea of Rockefeller Center that help it make sense as the city of the future, not just as a kind of retard-a-terre, wonderful Art Deco place, but something which doesn't press forward the goals of architecture, the definition of modernity. So, and if we look at the exhibition and the themes that we've already explored, this rooting this idea of the city of the future in New York rather than in architectural theory or in a vocabulary of architectural styles, rooting the ideas in the reality of the urban context and the theories, if you can call them that, really sort of the practical formulas that were addressed by architects who are trying to solve the problems of the present. That's what I think I can contribute through in the research to a story of Rockefeller Center or a story of New York Modern. So that this idea of the city of the future goes back not to 1928 or 1925 and Paris and Art Deco, or not to Le Corbusier and towards the new architecture, but to a series of investigations and images that were promoted in the popular press as well as in professional circles. So an image like this 1922 drawing by Hugh Ferris. This is part of a suite of drawings that he did and published when he wrote the article for the New York Times Magazine called The New Architecture, that we've seen a number of times already. This kind of urban development of intense commercial capitalist growth, ornamented at its top layers with architectural landmarks, with a kind of panoply of styles, whether it's Islamic or classical or with little Corinthian temples. This idea of sort of transforming the city into a city of towers, or really a mountainous city of set-back skyscrapers, is a kind of leitmotif that's developed through the 1920s. The next, please. Ferris himself develops it towards a more modernistic style in a drawing of 1926 that you see here called Towering Terraces. And here we begin to approach much more the kind of imagery that, that you see leading up to the design, in the design studies of Rockefeller Center, and then, you know, indeed in the rooftop gardens that we see and in the observation decks on the top of the RCA building. The next, please. And in an article in the New York Times in 1931, the very expression of City of the Future, the Hanging Gardens of New York, and so you can read the subtitle as well as I, the Babylonian dream may soon be made a reality in Radio City. It's seen by the architects as a huge experiment holding the possibility of a completely transformed metropolis. This is the New York Times. They buy it, right? This isn't a press release. This is an article in the Sunday magazine. You could be opening yours this next Sunday and say, what is the city of the future? This is, to me, this is futuricity. It's the belief that in the optimism that we can reinvent the city, that the city is reinventing itself by growth, by its continuous growth. Rather ironically, here in 1931, since we're already experienced the stock market crash and recession, the Depression, but this firm belief that things will get better, and that as the city grows, it can be rationalized, the growth can be channeled, controlled, and made more urbane, made more beautiful, with more amenities in the architecture, in the public spaces, in the garden rooftops. The next, please. And this idea goes back into the early 1920s, and we saw it here with Harvey Wiley Corbett in the drawings that Hugh Ferris did for him for the Architects Committee for the New York Regional Plan. The New York Regional Plan and its environs, as it was called, the RPNY. In 1923 and 24, this series of drawings of multiple levels of wheel, of rail, wheel, and pedestrians, so that the cars would stream below on streets that have been built over with an upper level sunlit plazas, and the new setback skyscrapers will step back in terraces and have, as we saw them in those in the other images of just the year before, into temples and sort of architectural scenography on the top floors, protected in the shade under loges. The next, please. Or in a series of arcades that would line the streams of traffic in the streets below. And this is an image developed for Harvey Wiley Corbett, and he was making the analogy in a series of articles that he wrote of Venice. New York would become like Venice, where the cars would not be on canals, but they would be on lower levels, and would stream by below as pedestrians would safely cross and be segregated from the cars. The next, please. He practiced this argument over and over again in public speeches, in professional magazines, in the Saturday Evening Post, and we talked about those when we looked at Corbett for a full evening. This article, The Different Levels for Foot, Wheel, and Rail, that he published in the American City, shows a Hugh Ferris drawing similar to the one you saw before. So again, in the early 1920s. This is published in 27. The next, please. And he revived, as he did over and over again, the series of Ferris drawings that show the gradual transformation, so the evolution of the 19th century city, with the streets that in the 20th are just filled and clogged with cars, to the lifting of the pedestrians on an upper level, then the bridging in more formalized and architecturally hefty bridges, and that continuous transformation is what you saw in the other, next please, the other slide. And the other architect that had a different solution but was concerned with the same problem was Raymond Hood. And in the lecture on Hood, we looked at his idea of the city of towers and its tower buildings and wider streets, which is one of the times, the several times that he published this idea, where he promoted the concept of point support towers, where you can see he's replacing these low-rise blocks, and so this is specifically applied to New York. The 5- and 6-story or even 10-story buildings that lined the Midtown cross blocks, he imagined would be replaced as the pressure to build new buildings played out on a particular site, that if the building were set back by a formula that he recommended for a new zoning law, set back from the street, and then that space was turned over to traffic, it would increase the sunlight and the circulation in city blocks. And you see that transformation here to there. And he promoted this over and over again. Interesting that you get sort of a 3-block super block here, which is a site like Rockefeller Center. The next, please. And in a model that we replicated for the exhibition, and that Hood had made of plasticine and placed on his desk, so that when clients came to visit him, he would be able to point to this model and to indicate the logic of his thinking and the kinds of towers that he might well be able to provide to a client who is looking to promote a more beautiful city, but also a tower with better light, air, and circulation for its tenants. The next, please. So another one of the many articles and sort of popular forums for describing this very optimistic vision of a reformed metropolis, of a smoothly smoothly circulating, a decongested midtown in this case. This is an article written by Harvey Wally Corbett where he's talking about 42nd Street reinvented. His own office was on 42nd Street by Times Square in the Bush building he designed. And here you see the kind of Hugh Ferris-like towers where a tower rises over a full block site and it's penetrated by circulation systems of highways or streets, and the pedestrians are carried on bridges above. This in 1929, at the time that he was competing for the commission for Rockefeller Center. The next, please. So these optimistic visions of how a future New York might be reinvented to function more efficiently and to be more gracious, urbane, and beautiful was very much a part of the context of the architectural discussion of the time. And the time that we're looking at now here is going back to 1928, and the first plans for Rockefeller Center, as it was still directed at the Metropolitan Square Corporation project that had the Opera House as its centerpiece. The focus was on the 3 blocks between 48th and 51st Street, and it's called the Upper Estate because it's the Upper Estate of Columbia University. Land acquired in a series of trades as they moved themselves from Lower Manhattan to Midtown to eventually to the Columbia Upper West Side campus. And what they left behind, but still owned the land and the leases on these lots, was a series of 3 blocks of rather rundown row houses of about 4 and 5 stories, sometimes 6. Brownstones that had been originally residential but had been converted into a whole range of different commercial uses, all of which were pretty downscale. It was usually referred to as an area of speakeasies, brothels, and sort of other businesses of shady repute. So the rents on these spaces were totaled about $300,000, little under $300,000. So let's say $100,000 a block on spaces here. But on the corners, there were also some old-time family, New York 400 family, like Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt's residence that you can see here. And these are beautifully labeled here from Dan Okren's book. And up here on 53rd and 54th Street were the Rockefellers' mansions. They're townhouses. They were mansions in as glorious as their appointments were, but they didn't look anything like as lavish as the Fifth Avenue chateau, which were characteristic of the period. The Rockefellers had been resident there since the last quarter of the 19th century. And there were holdouts on some of these other sites that were families that had held the property or for many generations, or had bought it out and just weren't ready to move, and some of them caught on that the Rockefellers were looking to assemble the site, and so were intransigent about moving. So, but the main portion of the land acquisition that you see here was able to be assembled, negotiated with Columbia for a sum of $3 million annually. And the rents on the properties were only $300,000 annually. So the difference between $3 million and $300,000 compelled the redevelopment of the site. Even as the stock market crashed, the project became completely commercially directed as the opera pulled out of the deal. And so the Rockefellers, John D. Rockefeller, and then his mortgage from Metropolitan Life were locked into the economics of a very high rent for for the land, a very low income for the underdeveloped properties that were on the site, and the additional problem that Dan Okrent parses in great detail as he's gone through all of the archives, the very great problem of buying out the subleases of, I think it's 228 different tenants on the site. So this gigantic financial proposition that is, more than a super tanker that headed across the ocean that you're trying to turn. There is no turning this thing. There was an inevitability once the lease was negotiated with Columbia that this would have to be developed to a much higher use. So Rockefeller Center went forward as of 1929. The next, please. Having spent a year in this guise and negotiation as the Metropolitan Square, where some commercial investment was to help pay for the Metropolitan Opera House and a large public, or relatively large public plaza that would be a gift to the city. The next, please. That idea, with the drawing by Benjamin Worcester Morris, dates back to a kind of lineage that, again, starts in 1923, 1924. This Hugh Ferris drawing, which is in our exhibition, of an art center, as it was called, is a project that's theorized by Harvey Wiley Corbett as a new centerpiece, as a kind of recommendation of one of the things that the city needs in order to become, a gracious, planned, and civic improvement project. So the regional plan, the architects' committee of the regional plan proposes a lavish art center, eventually played out in sort of a series of incarnations to become Lincoln Center around an open plaza with a kind of like a Doge's palace kind of set of low-rise buildings, and a tower rising behind this public plaza, as Ben Morris developed it in the first guise for the Metropolitan Square. The next, please. And Harvey Wiley Corbett was well aware of the idea for an art center and its relevance to the aspirations of the Rockefellers and Otto Kahn and the Metropolitan Square Club in providing a centerpiece for the city, but a commercial venture that would help to pay for it. So here, in his proposal to win the commission for Rockefeller Center, he only won a place on the team of the Associated Architects, but you can see that he's got in this Hugh Ferris drawing in a late 1928 guise. He follows that same idea that he had explored 4 years earlier, with the tower behind, rising up around an open monumental plaza, but here an even more overgrown program for commercial space, which would have been hotels and office buildings and department stores. So a kind of mixed use or multi-use civic center with commercial project. The next, please. There's two more images, and you can see how close these are to the proposals that he offered back in the early 1920s as an idealized form of a reformed city. Here was a client who actually wanted to do that, and he was very excited, as were many other architects who, of course, wanted that commission. And a number, the next please, a number competed for the opportunity. This is the third of the Ferris drawings, and you can see how it relates to the earlier versions of the pedestrian promenades from the regional plan. The next, please. Corbett's, the series of drawings that Corbett developed with Ferris, but then also in these renderings in sections through the site, show how that he was piling a great deal of density onto the three blocks. And part of the program, once the project switched to commercial from the Opera House, was to provide something like between 4 and 5 million square feet on these 3 block site, because the new program was a commercially viable project. And so you can see the sort of almost typical New York development, with the setback skyscrapers filling up pretty much all of the site. The next, please. This didn't win the day because this sort of lingering idealism about providing a central plaza that was a kind of civic forum was held on through every iteration of the project. We've seen in this image before Harvey Corbett here, Raymond Hood here, looking at a series of models that are pretty much the kind of density that Corbett was proposing. But as these architects came together, see Reinhard here of Reinhard and Hofmeister, and then I'm not sure who all the others are, but we're going to see them. Actually, here's Hofmeister. We'll see them in the lineup of the sort of management and creative team in a series of diagrams that were developed for the Architectural Forum in a few minutes. But here they're studiously examining for a press promotional photograph what they're all going to do as a team to develop Rockefeller Center's 3 blocks. The next, please. And so here they are, so the cast of characters. They look like sort of, you know, like the movie star heroes or something. Reinhard and Hofmeister were brought in by J.R. Todd, who was the project manager. He's really the mastermind for the whole project. He worked out the details of the floor plans with Reinhard and Hofmeister, who were well known. Well, they were young, but what they were known for was doing very well floor plans in the belly of the building. They were kind of the Emery Ross of their day, of the 1920s. And for J.R. Todd, they had designed the Gray Bar building by Grand Central, and they had done it very well, packing a lot of office space on a very compact core with good sunlight in a place that was right so conveniently by the train station and the subway nexus. So they were really unknown architects in the architectural community. They had no particular stature as brand name starchitects, as we call them today, but they were architects who knew how to do a floor plan, who knew how really to pack a plan and to work everything efficiently. Then Corbett was sort of a senior figure in architectural circles. He worked with his younger partner, Wallace K. Harrison, and McMurray. So Corbett, Harrison, and McMurray worked together as a team, and Corbett was brought in for his sort of stature of urban theories and for his knowledge of infrastructure and his commitment to sort of figuring out the traffic problems, and for his sort of general stature in the profession, because he lectured, did the lecture circuit, and he was, of course, as we saw in the lecture on him, promoting always this idea of intense urbanization and packing a lot of, I won't say congestion, but of density on the site. Then Raymond Hood is really, as we looked at last week, the brilliant bad boy of architecture. He was, you know, the kind of superstar of the circle, and he was he's sort of the media star of the architectural world at the time, as well as a brilliant inventor within the styles, and certainly someone with the kind of business sense that knew how to turn his artistic goals into, through an economic argument, into a winning punch with his clients. And we saw that with the Daily News building, and we see it again here with Rockefeller Center. His partners, his business, especially the business manager of the firm, Fouillou, and then the structural engineer, the MEP engineer, and H.B. Alexander, who oversaw the rather elevated and somewhat vacuous art program that was developed to unite the whole of Rockefeller Center. The next, please. But it was really Hood who was the inventor of the forms and the conceiver of the master plan. It was Harrison then, tall Wally Harrison, who became one of the best friends of Nelson Rockefeller and really and sort of married into the family, or at least relatives of the family, and became really sort of the sidekick of Nelson, and succeeded then in a whole series of commissions throughout his life, whether it was the extension of Rockefeller Center, or it was one of the 1939 World's Fair, or the centerpiece buildings of the Lincoln Center, or the Albany Mall, which is probably his most disastrous design, but was done for under Nelson Rockefeller's governorship. He ascended, young as he was, through the Rockefeller Center project, and he was the person who was everywhere, and he was often the sort of negotiator among the three major firms that were called and combined the Associated Architects of Rockefeller Center. And there you see Reinhard sort of leaning against the model. Models were extremely important, the next please, in the design process. And we see them here in the studio and the office of the Associated Architects that was in the Gray Bar building. And they were done at all scales. We saw the little scale where they were considering the massing study of the different towers. As we saw with Hood last time, Hood worked in 3D. In models that were either in plaster or in plasticine, as you see here. And here there was even a sculptor, René Chamblin, who oversaw the model shops, except the studio was the model shop. There wasn't a place where you went and made models. The models were what you worked on, and the drawings were developed from the models. So this idea of sculpting in 3D, something that I've argued comes out of the idea of the fact of the zoning envelope and the idea of communicating it as sculptural mass that was so vividly and convincingly presented by Hugh Ferris in his zoning envelope drawings. The next, please. Just are a few other candid shots of what the office looked like as a small army of architects worked on the many different drawings that needed to be done for not just the RCA building was one of the first ones off, but these eventually 15 buildings on the site. The next, please. So the hierarchy as established in the creation of this gigantic project, you can see is led by the money bags of the whole proposition, John D. Rockefeller Jr., using some of his own vast fortune, but also some of the money, the mortgage money from Metropolitan Life. And then there's this whole team of management, of their partners at Columbia University with the leased land, of the sort of the accountants and creators of the renting blueprints, of the selling of the project with public relations, and of all these many legal contracts that need to be negotiated for just about anything that had to be done on the site. The architects, the combined as the Associated Architects of Rockefeller Center, all of the sort of associated engineering projects, the contractor, and especially the construction oversight, and all of it organized by J.R. Todd. The next, please. And here you see some of the gentlemen who were at work in masterminding both the financing and the rental, both the profits and the losses of the P&Ls of Rockefeller Center. The next, please. And J.R. Todd, at this by the steam derrick and on site, keeping his eagle eye on every single dime, and that's why Junior, as he was called, John D. Rockefeller Jr., felt so simpatico with J.R. Todd. The next, please.
It was young Nelson.
He was getting married at the time. Then he went on a very long honeymoon. When he came back, he dedicated himself to being involved in every aspect of Rockefeller Center, at first most disastrously with Diego Rivera murals, but then he continued to be the sort of the overseer of the public relations campaign and just about every decision that needed to be made as the project played out over the next decade. Some of the various iterations of the site plan were not as ingenious as the final resolution, and you can see early on I was promoted very seriously in a gigantic model that was presented to in a big press conference with dignitaries standing all around this central building that got nicknamed the oil can because it just really isn't, it doesn't have a particular dignity to it, and certainly distracts or detracts from the monumentality of the RCA tower. And so it pretty quickly was plucked out. It had been a real commission, the next place, for a deal that was being proposed with the Chase Manhattan Bank, which is one of the Rockefeller interests, that would have been certainly their featured anchor bank, but it certainly detracted from the whole unity of the ensemble of the complex of buildings. The next, please. And just because I have them, some of the floor plans that show you that bank building, and here labeled the department stores, so there, and then the theaters that you can see above. It took a long time to work out the program for Rockefeller Center, a program that would pay back. And theaters were always a major part of the conception of the balance of uses that would generate activity during the day and the night to move people through the center, and would therefore enhance by its mixed use the value of the office buildings where people would have more to do. They would it would give a kind of density to the street that would allow for retail that was trying to be sold off in the ground floor of all the spaces, as well as the underfloors, which eventually led to the subway, but not until well after 1937 when they tore down the elevated and began the excavation for the subway that we think of today, connecting Rockefeller Center across this big broad avenue of Avenue of the Americas, or 6th Avenue. The next, please. A crude drawing, but of the publications of the period, showed you the way that they were thinking about how you could take the limits of the zoning law with a block, a full crosstown block that stretched between the avenues of 5th and 6th, and what would we be allowed to build on over with an unlimited tower over a quarter of the site, and then how alternatively that same kind of volume could be disposed in order to ensure much greater light around the centerpiece building, and towers that would take up some of the space but still be spaced apart, so that there would be both the ensemble, the good light, the visual draw in from the street, and this idea of taking this same amount of space and treating the 3-block site as the zoning unit rather than each individual block yielded the plan of the massing plan of Rockefeller Center. The next, please. And we see that beginning to evolve in these plasticine solid sculpted models with the channel gardens and the English and French houses that were sold off as a successful piece of marketing to the nations of France and England, and then the towers that are smaller here than they were added, but in one of the earlier versions of the plan, almost as tall as and challenging the RCA building. The next, please. It was called the RCA building because as they marketed this project, to everyone that the Rockefellers knew, and of course, and everyone the Rockefellers did business with. There was a lot of arm twisting, I guess, and worse in terms of threats of loss of business to the vendors, to the affiliates, to all kinds of businesses that were involved in the Rockefeller interests. And RCA took early on, of course, early on was right after the stock market crash, and then as the economy generally continued to decline, the needs of the Radio Corporation of America, which were originally were to be half of the leased space, about 1 million square feet was the first lease for the space, basically halved, and so they cut back in their commitment or their agreement to take the space. But they did establish a program in the base part of the building that combined the radio studios, office spaces, newsrooms, a whole range of uses that one doesn't usually associate with skyscrapers being office buildings. So that sort of established the media identity of Rockefeller Center, that then was enhanced with the Time Warner building and the Associated Press building and a whole series of others. The next, please. Up to the Today Show today and Saturday Night Live. This is just to underscore the point about the solidity, this sort of aesthetic of mass, an architecture of mass, which was characteristic of the aesthetics of the 1920s in New York modernism, and will be in strong contrast to the direction of international style modernism after the early 30s. The next, please. So, so the other aspect of the invention in the design team, there's the master plan, largely contributed by Hood and Corbett together, especially Corbett with thinking about the circulation of traffic and the separation of pedestrians. The massing of the RCA building we'll look at in a moment in other versions, but what you see here with the hanging gardens and the rooftop gardens is an idea that was contributed by Hood. The next, please. Raymond Hood, and we talked about this last time, had an economic argument to present to clients like the Joseph Patterson, the publisher of the Daily News, and likewise to J.R. Todd. With Rockefeller Center, Hood thought that the rooftops could be developed as gardens, that this would realize this long-felt dream of futuricity in the 1920s of turning rooftops into a kind of visual carpet and park space. Hood talked about this with his bridge homes as well. You bring the country into the city. You lift nature on top of the rooftops so that clean, refreshed air and the areas for sunbathing become part of the amenities of the city. And with Rockefeller Center, there was an opportunity to realize this. In fact, he said there were 7 acres of roofs in Rockefeller Center over the 11 acres of the site. And he argued to J.R. Todd one day that that commercial buildings, office buildings like the ones around Bryant Park, received much higher rents because people looked out onto the beautiful nature and lovely scenes. And they were willing to pay more for rents than if they had looked out on tar paper rooftops and water tanks. And he said, well, Mr. Todd, if you had to say how much more rent would it be worth for those buildings that overlook parks, and Todd answered about $1 a square foot. And Hood said, well, if we provide the gardens, think of all of these millions of square feet of space that you're created are looking down on parks, and multiply that by $1 a square foot. The next, please. These are some of the Wenrich drawings that show that. And the next day, the model maker was brought in order to start creating foliage on the rooftops of the models, which we'll see in a moment. But this rather Beaux-Arts plan in watercolor by Wenrich shows the kind of mosaic ornament of the roof gardens on the lower-rise buildings, the top of the observation deck of the RCA building, and throughout the roof gardens ornamenting all of the rooftops to a greater extent than was actually realized, but of course many were constructed. The next, please. Not as many survive today as were there originally. So these are the models. There, Chamblon was brought in order to start the kind of gardening or the gardenings of the roofs. The next, please. Clay gardens. And so you see them on some of the low-rise buildings that move out towards 6th Avenue. These were the international gardens on those roofscapes. The next, please. At the Channel Gardens, these landscapings still survive today. From 5th Avenue down to the plaza in front of the RCA building, you can see are decorated with a series of fountains and stairs there's an incline, a small slope that comes from 5th Avenue down towards the sunken plaza, and then was supposed to draw you in through its gravity flow into the lower level of shops that are on the underground floors of the RCA building. That never worked out very well, and they had to reinvent that zone with the ice skating rink in order to turn it into a success. There you see some of the roof gardens. Next, please. And of course the observation deck, which was a pay-as-you-go revenue producer it's called the 70th floor. Not really 70 floors, but it's always called the 70th floor. I guess you have to count the sub-levels as well. And these are the sort of they were called the Catskill chairs or something. They're Adirondack. Thank you, Adirondack chairs. Wrong mountains, but they are certainly supposed to give you the feel that you are on a mountaintop with the fresh air, with the sort of brisk wind, and with surveying endless views. So here on the very top floor of the RCA building, you get a little bit of Gothicizing ornament, but sort of nothing but sky above. The next, please. So very quickly, the documentation of the design is sort of more than we could ever begin to handle in an evening. There were a number of issues of Architectural Forum dedicated to the whole project of Rockefeller Center. This one you see is the centerpiece. Next please. In January 1932, contains some of these John Wenrich drawings. I'm sorry the color is really off on this because these are very soft pastels, very atmospheric. Wenrich drawings have a completely different sensibility than Ferris's dark charcoal, and with these very light colored, almost sort of Easter sort of whitish and pinkish pastels. Wenrich really romanticized the kind of Palisades-like cliff masonry of the center's towers, and then the terraced gardens. The next, please. He did a whole series of these, and the RCA building shows the shearing back of the straight-up tower-like narrow, sort of slender axis view, and then a series of recessions that were Raymond Hood's idea of shaping the tower. Actually, Harrison wanted to be a little bit more European and international style, but Hood argued that it needed some kind of sculptural form and a kind of bas relief of slight recessions in order to sort of accelerate the facade as it rose up into the sky. So each one of these is slightly shorter or closer together as it rises. But also these setbacks mark where the elevator banks fall off. So they actually reflect something that's happening in the floor plan program, and they keep this first class A office space, first quality space of an office that lease span that's never any more than 27 feet from an outside window to an interior corridor. So as each one of the elevator banks drops off, so the building presses in, and it keeps that uniform perimeter of 27 feet. The next, please. In the stacking and the lining up of the windows and the recessed aluminum panels, but then this very flush, very planar masonry, very taut, without texture. You get the sensibility that we've seen before in Raymond Hood in the Daily News building, executed in the black and white brick. The next, please. But here, more conservative. Limestone was considered a conservative material. But there's the Hood City of Towers. The tower just shoots out of the ground, and you get the controlled axis so that when you're on Fifth Avenue walking by, or I ride my bicycle down here, and every time I'm on my bike, I always sort of look up and try to catch the moment when you're right symmetrically on axis and looking up the tower. And I always say Raymond Hood when I pass by there on my bike, but you have to be very careful because there's a lot of traffic around too. The next, please. So very quickly to look at the site. Cleared out, here's Saks Fifth Avenue. You can see how much of Midtown had actually already been developed in the late 20s by other towers, but towers that were averaging about 35 or maybe 45 stories. All speculatively developed, but pretty much all by the left courts and a whole range of investors who knew how to develop a building with these good Class A office space, well filled with light. A tower controlled by the zoning laws, 25% of the tower. A height pretty much limited by the size of the lot, which is the 200 feet that you could get if you could get a full frontage of a block, or maybe 100 feet square. And so the zoning law really created the building form for you. And you see that throughout Midtown, which is what makes Rockefeller Center so extraordinary. It wasn't limited in any way by a template of zoning. It had a site so large they could do anything that they wanted, but yet it demanded in this scale a kind of unity that differentiated it from the rest of the sort of diverse and sort of ragged and competitive character of the small lots of Midtown. And here you see the low-rise that's had still been preserved in this zone that had not yet been the target of development. Next, please. And as the site goes up, this one's a little hazy, but you're going to see back here, actually, this steel frame is starting to rise. You'll see in the next image, with the elevated down here on 6th Avenue, not even recognizable to us anymore when we think of 6th Avenue as something that was dark and hazy and sooty and always cast in shadow. Today it stands as a very broad avenue with the setback of the western section of Rockefeller Center developed in the post-war period. The next, please. These are all images from the New York Public Library. The foundations had to be drilled, blasted down out of the bedrock, so there was an enormous amount of expense of dynamiting and carrying off these many thousands of tons of bedrock that were needed in order to sort of scoop out enough area for the foundations that there could be this subterranean city, as well as parking and service areas below. The next, please. There goes some of the bedrock and the natural stream that is, close to the surface and falling in like the waterfall at the top of the tower being replaced. I mean, man's triumph over nature here is sort of turned upside down, so the waterfall is going to be on top of the skyscraper rather than under it. The next, please. Here's the plaza area for the RCA building, and so you can see how the underground level zones are being scooped out, and so all of this is going to be a kind of city under a city. The phrase city within a city was applied to many large projects, and very frequently to Rockefeller Center, and probably more true than any of the others, like Grand Central, where the phrase was also used. This multiplication and mix of uses really did have an urban quality in terms of the mix. The next, please. The tower rising. The next. And an invention of the press department of Rockefeller Center, and it was considered a brilliant coup at the time, the Sidewalk Superintendents Club. So the people are always fascinated with construction sites, and today you're not welcomed anywhere close to it. You have to sort of move around, and they spill out into the street. But the idea here of turning it into an attraction was one of the many brilliant moves of sort of manipulating public opinion and keeping people engaged in this project. The next, please. Because it's easy, I think, when you have the world's richest man, who is not particularly public, for the public to be alienated from that. So keeping Rockefeller Center in the public eye, keeping the stories always good news stories, even in the midst of the Depression, and inventing these uses which were sort of gregarious, attractive uses, like the music hall, like the observation deck. And there's and the observation deck here you see with the scale of some of that architectural ornament that looks small when you're on the ground, but you can see the scale of it as you look, you cast eyes up to Central Park. The next, please. And the plaza, of course, and the artwork throughout. The Paul Manship Prometheus, that's remains the glorious centerpiece of the plaza, but now with the ice skating rink in front of it. But you can see here this sort of two-sided character, the ambivalence of Rockefeller Center as the idea of the future, but also in its program, whether it's the artwork or the architecture, always sort of being pulled back to the classical connection. The next, please. And the sunken plaza, you can see how it operated to try to bring people down onto the plaza, to turn that into an urban space. But this is a car, I think, for a show promotion. Rather, it's not. Cars weren't able to get down here, and they certainly didn't drive down there. But they tried to draw you into the commercial spaces, but you can see nobody would want to go in there, and they didn't. It was a very unsuccessful commercial venture until they put the restaurants and especially the ice skating rink down. Next, please. And just some other views of how the architecture operates with the art programs and the conservative nature of the sculpture, but this sort of modern classicism of the stone architecture, but yet the sort of rush of modernity of verticals, the same thing that we saw as the vocabulary of Hood in a number of his buildings. The next, please. And these other uses, this is just to remind us that we're not going to look at the Rainbow Room. We saw a little bit of the observation deck for the NBC studios that have occupied the site now for many years. The next, please. And, of course, Radio City Music Hall, the most spectacular theater in America, largest interior theater with the spectaculars that were put together by Roxy Rothafel, who was the impresario of the the idea of the music hall in a great failed effort that Dan Okrent documents very well about the opening night and how the kind of stage show that he conceived was greeted with almost unanimous critical denouncement, and then was reinvented into the combination of the movie theater and essentially vaudeville show, the next place, with, of course, the centerpiece Rockettes, and survives now today as sort of America's and the world's favorite entertainment, especially at Christmas time when everybody who is a tourist in New York needs to make a stop at the music hall and see the Rockettes show. The next, please. And some of the other stuff, the ballerinas posing in the grand foyer before the auditorium. The next, please. And the industrial designers like Desky and Norman Bell Geddes, who worked on the lower ranges of what would have been like the smoking rooms and down to the lower levels with the bathrooms and other facilities. The next, please. That kind of streamlined style was extremely well done, especially by the interior designers who were I think the most progressive creative forces. Not the artist programs, but the industrial designers really defined Rockefeller Center as modern, whereas the artists were connected to both to the classical past, but also to themes that had a kind of 19th century character to them. But after Rockefeller Center, then what happened to the future? What happened to futuricity? The next, please. The future of the skyscraper was much discussed through the 20s and even into 1931. You can see that the projection is that leading architects predict larger, all-metal structures linked to in city-like groups like Rockefeller Center envision the part these giants are destined to play in urban life of America. Next, please. Timing proved that that would not be the case. But this idea of modernity continued to play out even as the particular style of New York modern seemed to come to an end in the early 1930s. A definition of modern in 1927 that would feed into the international style. This was presented pretty much from a European perspective, and with many avant-garde European artists participating in the Machine Age exposition. In New York, showed Russian and German and French avant-garde designers, and really from all over the world. And the American architects participated. You remember that Hood and Ferris showed glass skyscrapers. But this idea of the Machine Age, not that the machine would make the modern style, the next please, became the impulse more than the style of Rockefeller Center with its limestone facades and its Gothic ornament. Of other Rockefeller ventures, the Museum of Modern Art, founded by a group of women, but most devotedly led by Abby Rockefeller Jr.'s wife. And in 1932, they presented with Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, the International Style Show, the architecture of modern architecture with a catalog that became the international style. The book that defined the international style, the next place. And that style, imported from Europe, emphasized horizontality, not the vertical of the skyscraper, of simplicity, of space rather than mass, of banded windows like this that showed you the transparency with the space within, and avoidance of any applied ornament was also one of the characteristics. So the architecture speaks just from its form, and the form is supposed to follow function. The next, please. And that style began to take over in the building type of skyscrapers in a model project in Philadelphia, the PSFS building by William Howe and George Howe and William Lescaz, the Swiss architect, so a kind of imported modernism, a Eurocentric modernism, where you can see the horizontal banding, the sense of a kind of taut skin that stretches around the building, and those banded windows that show that carry over a kind of streamlining effect and indicate the space within, rather than the punched out windows, the small holes that penetrate the facade of the typical New York skyscraper at the time. And this was very much a part of the discourse and the rhetoric of modern, international style modern, and a kind of New York modern that clings more to tradition. The next, please. As the members, the leaders of the European avant-garde came to New York, as the artists had done in previous decades, but especially on the first trip by Le Corbusier, in 1935, when he came to New York and managed to attract a press corps around his many pronouncements about the character of New York and how it might be reinvented according to Corbusier's designs, the plans he had done for Paris that we looked at before, from his writings of from 1922 on for the contemporary city, or 1927 towards the new architecture. And he looked at, of course, the RCA Building at Rockefeller Center. And the next, please. And he looked at the skyscrapers of New York that were rendered by Hugh Ferris, and he compared them to the architecture of Europe of the past. And he looked at the skyline of New York that seemed to grow without order, and he recommended a rationalized city of towers to reform to reform not just New York, but America. And of course, he was promoting himself. The next, please. And that idea, whether it came from Corbusier or it came from the Bauhaus or one of a host of European architects who did manage to sort of control the discourse, to define a style. And as it was communicated through the Museum of Modern Art and then through a series of professional journals, this idea of a modernism that's taken over the precepts of the European aesthetics of interior space rather than mass sculptural mass, a kind of monumental solidity, of truth to materials, an expression of materials of the new age, like metal and glass. This aesthetic took hold in the U.S. And whether we look at the New York World's Fair, and with its centerpiece here is the Trilon in Paris Fair, as designed by Wallace Harrison, and Harrison and his then partner Abramowitz. The next, please. Or the the main pavilion in terms of commercial pavilions, the one that was most successful, the Futurama, for the General Motors Corporation, where this whole architecture with the human scale down here of ramps that are waiting lines sort of engineered the experience of the future that was driven by cars and which was envisioned by, the next please, the industrial designer Norman Bel Geddes. When you got on the ride, you sat down in a car seat, but as if you were in an airplane flying over the American continent. So in 1939, what is the city of the future? The next, please. It's an American continent that's connected by highways. It's laced with these concrete ribbons that go through the reinvented cities. And you can see that the skyscrapers take over the horizontal lines, the banded windows, the streamlining and the sensibility of the European international style. They also spread out to a much greater degree than the New York Rockefeller Center or the New York visionary solutions that were proposed by Corbett and Ferris. The next, please. As they spread out across the U.S., the towers are spaced as their own centers rather than connected and sort of glued together by the economics and the energy of the city. They're not around the nexus of transportation. They're now they're able to be separated by being serviced by vehicles, by automobiles, rather than by trains and mass transit. So this direction, if you think of this as Miami or something, where you drive into a parking garage and your office tower is above, or your apartment house is in a tower above, did predict the future better, perhaps, than at least the end of the 1920s and early 1930s with Rockefeller Center as a model. The next, please. And you came out onto a street of the future, of course, populated by General Motors cars, but in a kind of streamlined version of the Harvey Wiley Corbett's future city solutions of 1923 and 24, with pedestrian streets and commercial buildings and a sort of streamlined automotive culture below. The next, please. And in the architecture after World War II, because of course the Depression was followed by, and 1939 was in fact the outbreak of World War II in Europe. In 1941, when the U.S. joined the war, the forces of construction and production were directed at the war economy. But the recovery in the early 1950s, and this is the model for the Chase Manhattan Bank, One Chase Manhattan Plaza, that was designed by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill back in about 1955. They started the construction in 1956 and it was finished by 61. So in the early 1960s, the sensibility, the next please, of this new architecture and building for the future, a new approach, marked a new style of skyscraper in every form, in its materials of metal and glass, of a plate glass that would eventually become thermal pane, but wasn't at the time, so it was extremely inefficient, but it was able to be large expanses of glass because the interior environment was now controlled by air conditioning. The next please. It was lit by fluorescent lights, which could illuminate deep spaces rather than to draw the majority of the light in the workplace from daylight. So this revolution of materials, of technology, of construction with bolting and welding rather than riveting, with the interior environment being now controlled artificially. This created new possibilities of architectural form that were imprinted by the aesthetics of the international style, and the next please, and ironically tended to look more like one another perhaps than even most of the architecture of the 20s. So that the idea of the slab form that some people like to trace back to the RCA building, but I think that doesn't really follow as an analogy. But these slender slab towers, prismatic forms, pulled back from the street line in open plazas, might be thought to be influenced by the open plaza of Rockefeller Center, a kind of urbanism that aerates the street level and that values sunlight in the spaces around the footprint of the tower. And here you see the One Chase Manhattan in the background, and these are all SOM buildings, Marine Midland Plaza, and what started to be the U.S. Steel building in its hefty steel form, but is called One Liberty Plaza. The next please, and of course the World Trade Center. And so if we think of superblock projects, okay, the World Trade Center on its 16 acres is somewhat larger than the 11 acres of Rockefeller Center, and it's one of the few projects in New York that was able to undertake that ambitious scale. Of course, the scale of the superblock, but also the scale of the towers, the tallest in the in the world at the time they were conceived, and the largest as well in terms of the amount of floor space that they created. An acre of floor on each, an acre on each floor times 210 stories. Next, please. And that idea of modernism in the international style also jumped the avenue and extended into Rockefeller Center West Side in 3 buildings that were designed by Wallace Harrison, which were so much alike that they were called within the office the XYZ buildings, and became the headquarters for major corporations, including Time Life and Exxon. And it stands both in lineage of the Rockefeller Center complex in the way that they pull back from the street and value the plaza, but also too in strong contrast in this the rectilinear upright simplicity and just the simple striping without any kind of sculptural articulation or relief in the facade. I think one more, the next. So, no, go back a second. Go back on that one a minute. Because as we conclude about what is it about Rockefeller Center that makes it so successful as urbanism, and will be the subject of our discussions on May 8th, I want to read a little bit from Daniel Okrent, whose paean to Rockefeller Center is summarized in its last paragraph, saying, why has no one been able to be so successful as to duplicate Rockefeller Center? Why have none of the scores of office or cultural complexes all over the country, every one of them inspired by Rockefeller Center, even approached the original's aesthetic, commercial, and there's no other word for it, emotional success? And he says, if you contrast that to Lincoln Center, which seems to be kind of vacant and doesn't have a day life as well as a night life, he says in this concluding paragraph, it wasn't a destination in the city, Rockefeller Center. It was organically the city itself, the city where the privately maintained sidewalks were spotless, where the ramp-relieved cross streets were free from delivery trucks, where the flowers and the flags and the sun slicing down between the buildings and onto this surprisingly small open space conveyed exactly the same thing that it had suggested to the fortune writer in 1936, who wrote, "Rockefeller Center begets a sauntering mood." And Daniel Okrent says in conclusion, and by evidence, it always will. So the next, please, and this is the last image. That the timelessness of Rockefeller Center is one of the things I think that we feel today. It's success, and it's also a future frozen in time. It's timelessly modern, and it's modern out of time, or only in its own time, and it's a thing unto itself, it seems to me. Why is it so successful as urbanism, and why can't it be replicated? I think for my answer for that is in part in agreement with what Dan writes, that you go through Rockefeller Center. It's part of the city. It's not a place that you go. It's a place that you move through because it belongs to the city. You traverse it. You live in it. And you're attracted to it as well, the way tourists are today. But the thing that makes Rockefeller Center not of New York and unique to New York is what you see in this view when it's still under construction. It's the diversity of New York. It's the New York character, which is single lots developed by individuals in their competitive energy, in the sometimes assembling somewhat larger sites, but in this sort of incredible and relentless diversity, as Rem Koolhaas called it, of what New York is. The harmony of Rockefeller Center is something that's set apart. It's monumental, it's enormously successful, and it seems to me, through all of these decades, the 75 years, it will remain the success that it is and will be, because it stands out of time. And it's not something that you can replicate, because the thing that makes Rockefeller Center unique is the New York that doesn't participate in the ensemble and the harmony of Rockefeller Center that you see all around it. That's what makes Rockefeller Center special, the way it's carved out, the way that it can never be recreated, where it took that special attention and opportunity that the world's richest man, being trapped into a project that began as philanthropy but became commercial, and then had to succeed in order to survive with all of the business talent and experience that was brought to bear by not just by the Rockefellers, but all the businessmen who were their comrades and colleagues in the project, and then by this energy and the aura that surrounded Rockefeller Center that people like Nelson Rockefeller brought to it, so that it became the chicest place in New York, so that the Rainbow Room was the height of luxury, and that everything about the cachet and the celebrity that surrounded Rockefeller Center came with this inimitable condition of bringing together the celebrity of great wealth, the necessity to succeed, and the chronology of the Depression, and then the decade of development that it took in order to play out this idea of the city of the future rising above New York and carving out a place in New York, but where New York, as you can see in this view, is greater than the project.